Welcome to Political Fictions, a podcast that's trying to negotiate a top secret loan to keep the government afloat. My name's Cory, and joining me is a harassed PPS trying to solve an impossible murder. It's Mark Pack. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Cory.
And also joining us is an heir to a huge fortune, but you also get the impression there's a bit more to her than meets the eye. It's Dr. Elinor Taylor. Hello, Elinor.
Hello.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm a lecturer in English literature and sort of cultural historian of the interwar period. So I'm particularly interested in kind of writers' relationships with political organisations.
And thank you for joining us. And we're talking about the Division Bell mystery, a detective story in which the murder takes place in the Houses of Parliament. So give us a second to examine the crime scene, and then we'll discuss the evidence. First item on the agenda, Events Dear Boy, prepping for this episode. It's the second time I've read it.
I read it years ago, but when I came back to it to read it for this discussion, I'd completely forgotten who the murderer was. And I actually had still forgotten about 2/3 of the way through the book as well. I'm not sure if that's to do with my memory or whether it's something very clever about the plotting of the book and the sort of the kind of blind alleys that it takes you down. But yes, I remembered certain things about it very well. But the actual way the mystery unfolds had completely gone out of my mind by the time I came back to it.
So to make you feel better, I read the book for this podcast. So I read it a few weeks ago. And last night I realised I had forgotten who did the murder. So I hurriedly reread some key parts of the book. So if any of my comments about the book seem completely eccentric, that may well be because I'm talking about the wrong plot. I'll warn you now.
That's the kind of high production value people expect from
absolutely.
This podcast. And we should say, actually, we're going to not spoil who the murderer is. Not just because Mark's forgotten.
I wouldn't be able to even if I wanted.
If you could, the idea is that you should be able to listen to this episode and then read the book and then be surprised who the murderer is. Or equally, Ellen, I'd completely forgotten. And I think if I read this book in a decade, I'd also have forgotten who the murderer is. And it is
that sort of sums up the book in a way for me, because I mean I'm sure we'll talk about all sorts of elements of it, but in a way it's almost like it's two different books, isn't it? It's Locked Room Golden Age murder mystery, and it's a political thriller set in the Houses of Parliament. And at least for me, the latter, it's brilliant. Right from the opening line, I love it. This really feels like I'm in the genuine politics of the interwar period. The Locked Room murder mystery, it's okay. But, even I've got probably a dozen, well, more than a dozen, couple of dozen better, I would say, Golden Age Locked Room murder mysteries on my shelf. Anyway, that's it. End the podcast. All summarised. On we go.
For those of us who want to slightly delve in a bit deeper, that do either of you read detective stories for pleasure? Because, as you say, Mark, this is a proper old-fashioned 1930s Golden Age detective story.
The interwar ones, yeah, definitely. After the war, I think it gets taken over by the spy novel. This is very much the kind of height of the Golden Age, 1920s, 1930s. It's the era of sort of Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and those sorts of people, and they really were a kind of cultural phenomenon. And they're quite interesting because they attracted both men and women and sort of cross-class readers. They were very popular with sort of commuters in the interwar period, who were coming in from sort of like what John Betjeman called Metro land in sort of northwest London, and it was the kind of thing that you'd pick up at the sort of W.H. Smith in the station on your way to work. So yeah, they sort of pervade so much of interwar culture. A lot of them have kind of fallen away now. But I mean, it's interesting that the author of this book, Ellen Wilkinson, wrote it when she was out of Parliament for a few years. She lost her seat in 1931, and she seems to have been trying to spin a bit of money by capitalising on this cultural the popularity of the genre.
Presumably, the commuting market explains why this novel, as with other similar ones, has a large number of quite short chapters. It's quite a sort of staccato rhythm to it, isn't it? But presumably that's, you want one chapter per tube journey.
Yeah, it's quite long for a book of that type. But yeah, you're quite right. They were divided up so that you could read in sort of like 5-minute, 10-minute bursts on the train. Yeah.
Do you read them, Mark?
Yeah, well, I used to read quite a lot more detective fiction. And then partly for no reason I can put my finger on, I just decided I no longer liked Agatha Christie. It just, something flipped in me. And And also, I've got more into reading espionage fiction, partly because of the excellent Shane Whaley, who runs a really good espionage fiction community. And in fact, really looking forward to doing a future podcast with Shane.
Yeah, we're talking about Jeffrey Archer, which it's not one of Jeffrey Archer. It's not a spy novel by Jeffrey Archer. Thank goodness. I read them quite a bit, and you're right. I think most people, it's Neo Marsh, Dorothy L. Sayers, Agatha Christie, the big three, aren't they? So this one, the Division Bell Mystery, you can get hold of it pretty easily now because it's been re-released as part of the British Library kind of crime classics series, and so there are quite a few novels that I've read as sort of part of that, and it does. I think it holds up pretty well compared to a lot of them.
It's just worth maybe saying on that when people have listened to this podcast and decided they really want to get the book, I thought the British Library Crime Classics edition has a really good foreword. I will now discover it's maybe from your academic nemesis, Ellen. but I just as in it gets a little bit into the literary theory almost, but in a way that is very accessible, and I think helps you see more of the book, even if you're not really an expert at such things. I thought, very well done edition, and it's a lovely front cover as well.
Yeah, I think the introduction by Martin Edwards is really good, sort of contextualising it and thinking about where it sits within that broader tradition. And there's also a preface by Rachel Reeves.
Whatever happened to her? Bit more time, I guess, to read detective novels now. Not sure.
Maybe she could write one as well. Maybe she could take inspiration and write one herself.
That's a Recess sort of, isn't it? Eleanor, I really like your plot synopsis, and it was so good I didn't write one of my own.
Almost like she's a professional, Cory. We're going to have to raise our game.
It's too late for that. We'll just have to, like all underachieving middle-aged men, we'll just have to wing it on the night and hope it goes all right.
So, yes, the Division Bell Mystery is a murder mystery that seems to be of the locked room type. So we have an American financier who is called Georges Loisel, who visits Parliament to have a private dinner with the Home Secretary. And the Home Secretary leaves him momentarily to go and vote on an important financial bill. And just as the division bell rings, a shot is heard, and Loisel is found dead, alone in a small dining room that apparently nobody could have got in or out of. And at first it looks like a suicide, but suspicions start to emerge that actually this isn't suicide and it's a murder. The investigation about the murder involves quite a lot of different characters and becomes potentially a kind of scandal that's going to engulf the government in a sort of in scandal and financial crisis and potentially bring it down. And similar to quite a lot of kind of golden age interwar fictions, we've got quite a few hallmarks of the genre. So we've got things like the locked room itself. We've got a notebook that's written in code. We've got a femme fatale character, Annette, who's the granddaughter of Loisel. We've got a mysterious encounter in a dark corridor. And we have a scene in which the characters restage the murder in order to try to sort of flush out the truth about it. And we've also got quite an interesting amateur sleuth who is called Robert West, who is PPS to the Home Secretary.
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, that leads us on very nicely onto All the President's Men. Cast and crew, or I guess author and characters in this case. So we mentioned this by Ellen Wilkinson, and yeah, as you've suggested in that synopsis, massive fan of classic detective fiction. So I think Rachel Reeves in her introduction says that she called her kettle Agatha after Agatha Christie, which I suppose is a bit of an indication. As you say, she was an MP sort of 1929 to 31. So wrote this after she lost the election, lost her seat in Middlesbrough first, wasn't it, in 1931, and was a PPS. So I suppose a lot of the experiences about West as a PPS are sort of derived from that experience. But I mean, she has a fascinating life, doesn't she? You could write a really interesting history of the British left in the first half of the 20th century, looking at her. So starting off as a paid organiser in favour of women's suffrage, and then helps found the British Communist Party. Does some work with the Spanish Civil War, organises Jarrow hunger marches, is involved in the Labour government. So she dies, doesn't she, 1947, while she's still a minister in the Labour government, and is also, as I say, involved in the 1929 one, also involved in the kind of wartime coalition for Labour as well. A really fascinating character who I feel like she's overdue someone writing a really good biography of her. So
if you're still listening, Rachel, and you've not gone for my murder mystery idea, maybe biography. How much other writing had she done, Eleanor? Because the thing that strikes me is it feels, to me at least, a little bit like a novel written by somebody who is a huge fan of crime fiction, but doesn't quite understand how crime fiction works. So, like, she doesn't have the usual setup of a detective and the sidekick. But instead there's a sort of a slightly awkward rotating cast of different pairs of people who are playing the role of detective and sidekick, as if you sort of know that you need to have two-handed scenes, but you don't realize the dynamic about the detective and the sidekick and why that works so well. But she also writes really well. So I both felt it was a novel both by an experienced writer and a novice at the same time.
I think that's exactly what it is. She had written an earlier novel called Clash, which is very much of a sort of social realist novel of kind of street organisation, basically. That one and this one are only two novels. She did write a huge amount of journalism, quite a lot of non-fiction writing, including a later book called Jarrow, Town That Was Murdered. It was published in 1939. A kind of narrative account of the Jarrow hunger marches. So you're quite right, she had written a huge amount, but this is her one and only crime novel. I think you're quite right that she knows what the conventions are, but doesn't quite understand why they're there. So yeah. I think that point that you made earlier, Mark, about the sense that it's almost kind of two books in one, which it's trying to sort of fit a political thriller into the shape of a crime novel, or a golden age crime novel, but isn't quite confident enough with those conventions to sort of to make it fully work. And instead, actually, it kind of ends up with slightly there seem to be almost like two different crimes slightly that are resolved in two slightly different ways. So it kind of starts to sort of pull itself apart. And that point about the lack of a consistent sidekick is a slight instability or strangeness in the book. So we get this character who is Robert West's friend, who's come back from Iraq for some reason, who's called Donald Shaw. It seems as though he's going to be the sidekick, but actually he just disappears.
Yes, and then
and then he reappears quite randomly, and he's clearly there at the beginning so that Robert has got somebody to show around, to just explain what's going on. But then it's almost as if Wilkinson doesn't really know what to do with him, and also he doesn't have access to the areas of the parliamentary estate that he needs to actually help solve the mystery. So he kind of doesn't really have. He's not actually very helpful to. And instead, we have, as you say, this kind of revolving cast of sidekicks and accomplices who are helping Robert along the way. So that sense that it's a novel by somebody who knows the ropes as a writer, but is a little bit sort of green when it comes to the genre.
Well, I guess firstly, there's one thing that I think that she does really well, which is she avoids the thing that I've decided I really dislike about Agatha Christie novels, which is, the first murder is not the last murder with an Agatha Christie novel. The first suspect is not yet. It just feels very, okay, we've got to get through 3 murders, 4 suspects before we get to the real plot. She doesn't fall into that sort of formulaic approach. But also, that whole detective plus sidekick was still a relatively fresh structure, I guess, at the time she was writing this. I mean, I'm always struck that the most successful detective novel of the 19th century is almost completely forgotten now, The Hansom Cab Murder, partly because it doesn't have detective and sidekick, and therefore it's aged a lot less well than, say, Arthur Conan Doyle and, Sherlock Holmes, which you might think, well, surely that would be the big famous bestseller. But Hansom Cab Murder is quite a fun novel in a way. But yeah, it suffers from the absence of that.
It almost feels like with Shaw that she forgot about him. And it's like, oh no, I mentioned this character at the start and now I've got to get them back in.
What it actually reminded me of is binge watching something like The West Wing, where if you binge watch something that's been made over a long period of time, you absolutely see that of there's this character that's in there for 4 episodes and then suddenly disappears for no good reason for 3, or, that sort of coming and going. Did she write it over a short period of time, a long period of time?
I don't know, actually. I don't know. It could have done with a good edit.
That maybe won't be appearing on the next reprint of the book.
It's a bit too long. The pacing is not great. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was written rather quickly.
And her politics were certainly left-wing, but was she particularly a feminist? I mean, she was a very pioneering politician, female politician, in terms of being an MP, a female MP when she was. But the reason I ask is that certainly some of the characters and the descriptions in the book seem to me quite sexist. And I don't know if that reflects just me reading it wrongly, so imposing the wrong set of values, as it were, out of time values on it, or whether that reflects what she felt she had to do in order to have a book that people would buy, or whether that maybe was her own view. Again, it reminded me of some of the early female espionage novels where they seem so sexist to me, and you think, amazing pioneer female author, so I shouldn't really be accusing them of being sexist, but it's really hard not to. So yeah, what's your take on her approach to such things?
She definitely on the left of the party and was involved in feminist organising as well as in anti-colonial organising and other things. But it's very much the feminism of its time. Even the more kind of radical strands of feminism look quite conservative socially to us today. In terms of the book, it is really interesting because so much of what we get is filtered through Robert West. It's written in the third person, but it does move away from him at particular times. Mostly we're seeing and hearing things from his point of view. We're told that he's from an old political family. He's public school and Oxford, and comes from this very, what we would call perhaps kind of establishment conservative family. And it's interesting why she chose that character. So a lot of the kind of viewpoints are kind of his viewpoints, and there's a point where he sort of says, "Oh, damn these modern women! If they could just be modern or women."
It's a lovely phrase.
It's not fair that we have to deal with But I think we're supposed to find that funny. The way the line is expressed is quite comic. That's not Wilkinson's own voice. It's his frustration and his inability to understand when the working class kind of socialist character, Grace Richardson, says, "Well, why should I help you?" And he just says, "Well, women have always helped me. That's what they're for." And
Oh, interesting, because I read that a little bit differently, because when Robert comes up with that lovely line, so I think, okay, that might be the sexist character that we're meant to laugh at a little bit, but then it goes on. Robert looked at his companion, so the sort of attractive woman, with a smile that usually worked wonders. It feels like almost like you're reading a Ian Fleming, book that actually the author isn't poking fun at Robert, but taking Robert and his worldview seriously. But you think she was definitely poking fun at him? I
think in those particular moments, I think we're supposed to like him and to feel that he is quite sympathetic. And she does suggest that he's very charming as well, and that all the kind of women seem to like spending time with him. So we're supposed to feel an appeal there, even if there's a bit of distance that's suggested between Wilkinson herself and I think some of the views that he's expressing. It is interesting why she doesn't choose a protagonist who is more like her. We do have, she was a working class woman from Manchester, representing, she represented Middlesbrough in her first kind of parliamentary years, and then returned as MP for Jarrow in the northeast. We do have a character called Grace Richards, who is left-wing working class MP representing the constituency of Stepney. And it's quite easy to sort of see Wilkinson reflected in her, but it is interesting why isn't she the sleuth? Why aren't we kind of following her around solving the crime? I think that's quite interesting. It's certainly interesting that Wilkinson chooses this kind of young conservative man to be her protagonist.
I completely agree that that West is quite a sympathetic character. He's a Tory, he's obviously a Tory PPS. This isn't like one of those shows like Yes Minister where it could be either Labour or Tory. It's pretty obvious which party everyone is representing, but it feels like quite a sympathetic portrait. I wonder if how many MPs the National Party have in after 1931, like 4,000 or something. It maybe seemed a bit more plausible to have someone from the government who's obviously conservative. I don't know if there's almost a bit of a Labour fatalism there. They can't even imagine Labour being in government in a fictional universe, the novel they're writing. I don't know. Art of the possible. So are there any similarities between this book and real events? I mean, this for me, I think, is the fascinating part of the book, and it makes me want to learn a bit more about the 30s, and you realise that probably my feeling about the 30s is maybe slightly two-dimensional, because there's so much of this book that feels so much more modern. There's a lot of this book about Britain's role in the world and the role of empire. But it's a bit of a mixture, isn't it? Because I think on the one hand, there's the self-confidence of Britain as this imperial nation and confidence in its institutions and politicians and civil servants and governing families who run it. But then there's this kind of underlying uneasiness at America, which I guess seems to come across as a couple of ways. And one of them is about the massive power of American finance and Britain feeling a bit insecure at that. There is literally a line in the book about the government going cap in hand for a loan. And how you've written this before 1976, that's spooky. But you mentioned Sherlock Holmes before. There's a lot of conversations where Robert West is talking about, oh, this is London, this isn't Chicago, there are no gangsters over here. And I think
it's quite a modern plot in the sense that I could very easily imagine a TV adaptation that relocated it into the 21st century. The basics of a government short of money, having to seek funding from elsewhere. I guess if you were to plonk it now, you might well switch the international arms trade aspect into maybe tech giants. The Houses of Parliament themselves have not changed very much as a building. The relative roles of different people in politics, ministers, civil servants, PPSs. I mean, it's the sort of the picture you get from Yes Minister. It's the picture you get from many other contemporary political dramas. So yeah, it both is very much of its time, which is partly, I think, a really good reason for reading the book because it's interesting in that respect. Yet also, you could transplant it into 21st century Westminster, couldn't you?
Yeah, I think its most interesting aspect for me is the way that it registers that kind of moment of transition, where Britain's influence in the world is uncertain. Its empire is starting to contract. You've had the Balfour Declaration in the previous decade and the Statute of Westminster. So the empire has clearly passed its sort of geographical peak and is starting to contract and disintegrate. Britain is in a very weak financial position and is effectively, trying to stabilise its currency, also the 20s and 30s, and that sense that it will increasingly become dependent on a sort of globalised financial system is very much there. And I think West at one point sort of feels sorry for the older generation of his party who can only see England as a little island leading the world, and he has this very strong sense that that is not the kind of the modern politics and the modern society that is coming into being, and he feels quite torn between that old England of his upbringing and this new England, which he sees being very kind of beholden to America financially, but also culturally. There's kind of reference to jazz bands and sort of mass-produced cinema and kind of Americanized culture in a sense that Britain is sort of losing its distinctive national identity, which was a huge topic of concern among interwar cultural critics, both on the kind of left and on the right. You get it even in George Orwell's slightly more nostalgic moments, that sense that there was something about English culture that is being lost under the sort of wheels of American capitalism. And that's one of the reasons why West is quite interesting, is because he's young enough to feel that change and to think about where he sits in relation to it. He gets on with the sort of socialist MPs who he identifies as being markers of that new world, particularly with their connections to Russia at the time, that he sees them as being kind of more modern, even as he disagrees with them politically. So I think it's a really interesting book for the way it feels that it's feeling its way through that transitional moment. It doesn't deal with it in a particularly overt way, and it's not a book that's trying to sort of solve that problem, but it really kind of runs through it at that sort of emotional level, I think.
I mean, it's not a didactic book, is it? I think that's one of its strengths. This isn't Ellen Wilkinson's manifesto disguised as a locked room murder mystery. It's much more interesting than that.
Quite fun to try that allegory, wouldn't it? Where I guess it'd be capitalism murdered in the locked room by the. But
this is one of your lesser ideas. Leave that one unwritten, Mark.
Elinor, what was her attitude towards sort of the establishment? Because one theme that comes through the book is this idea that it's really the civil servants who run things, which obviously, that's your classic British political fiction sort of trope with Yes Minister and so on. And if it hadn't been for it being a novel by a Labour MP from the interwar period, that seems fair enough. But, given how much Labour felt that the establishment was sort of in conspiracy against them. All the other parties ended up ganging up to vote them out of office. And so, yeah, I'm surprised that she seems quite chilled about the idea that it's the civil servants who really run things. I would have thought, that there would at least, even if she didn't in a didactic way attack that idea in the book, that she might at least throw in a character who was angry about that.
Yeah, it's slightly played for laughs, isn't it? The senior civil servant, George Beeton, is... I mean, I think to us, it's because it's such a kind of familiar archetype almost, that perhaps it was less funny at the time, I'm not sure. So, he describes how his department beat a new minister into an apologetic pulp within 6 months or something like that.
Yes.
It is slightly played for laughs, slightly played for the idea that, of course, we all know where the real power lies, and it's not with elected representatives at all. There isn't much anger in the book, actually, as a whole, which is a little bit surprising given what we know about her and her sort of... She was kind of famously hot-tempered and so forth, so you would expect it to be a bit more. But yeah, no, it is really interesting, and I don't quite know why. I mean, I assume she wanted the book to sell. There was a big market, and I think perhaps she was being a bit circumspect about what she was doing. That she didn't want to write a book that would just be obviously kind of didactic and alienating. I think she wanted it to work as a mystery first and foremost.
It's interesting what you said about the fear of American cultural imports coming in the 30s, because this is my ignorance really. I always thought that was more a kind of post-World War II phenomenon. I mean, there's a wonderful quote. I think it's basically from your classic purple-faced colonel out of Central Casting, which is, imagine what Palmerston or Disraeli would have said at the idea of Britain going cap in hand to such a creature for money. The British government, damn it, Robert, is this how we fought the war? And you think, if you gave me that passage out of context and said what year, this was written in a political novel, what year was that in? I wouldn't have guessed 1931. That feels like a classic, maybe 50s, 60s, 70s type answer. So it's just really interesting, all of the... all this thing, especially like Yes Minister, that kind of 70s, 80s sitcom, it's all here. As you say, there's the Yes Minister quote about ministers going native and two kinds of ministers those who go round and round and those who fold up instantly. And that feels like a bit of an echo of what Ellen Wilkinson's saying here.
And actually, in a way, had it turned out that Ellen Wilkinson is a nom de plume for Rachel Reeves and this book was written 2-3 years ago, that would have seemed quite plausible. It is very much a book of its time, but in a way that sort of some of those tropes have aged really well. It doesn't feel like it's a curio of the past. Maybe
the two things that are really in the novel that really, I guess, centre it in the 30s, one of them is that there's a delegation of hunger marchers who visit Parliament, which feels very 30s. And it's something that you've said, I don't know, I'm going to steal, which is that you don't see the public much in this novel. It's very much an inside baseball kind of novel in which it's press, civil servants, politicians, and whichever one of Robert West's mates is around to help him solve the murder at a particular point. It's not one where public are involved, but that's one of the few cases where you do have the public coming in, are those kind of hunger marches.
Yeah, and it's really important to remember that women had only had the vote on equal terms with men since 1928. There have been 2 general elections. So really, Britain's only very recently become a full democracy. It's really surprising that the people who were a kind of major feature of late interwar culture, this kind of obsession with the people and what they think, and how we speak to the people, how the intellectuals speak to people, how the politicians speak to the people, and so forth, which is a kind of anxiety that comes with that early moment of full democracy, full equal enfranchisement. And it really struck me that they're just not there in this book. The public, the people, are really absent, and presumably Robert West has a constituency. But who knows where it is? He doesn't care. The only time that anybody seems to have to go to their constituency is that the Home Secretary has to go back to his to launch a ship, and it's really inconvenient.
Although I guess that is reflecting what MPs were like at the time. That sort of constituency focus is a very well after the Second World War phenomena, really, in British politics. Even if you were in a marginal seat, you wouldn't be sort of, thinking of your constituency day in, day out.
Yeah. But what we do have a lot of is press. Press are there and constantly. We have a kind of a sympathetic journalist character, another one of West's friends called Sancroft. He's quite sympathetic, and he's actually one of the people that helps to solve the mystery. There's a concern about public opinion via the press, or what are the opposition papers going to say if we don't solve this very neatly and satisfactorily very quickly. And that's reflective of a particular moment of what was still early kind of mass media. There was genuine concern about public opinion, except that it's expressed in forms of anxiety about what the press are going to say.
It's really interesting. Makes me think, actually, the other time you see the public, as well as the Hunger Marches, the other time you see the public in the House of Commons is I think it is literally called the Delegation of Women Voters. And again, in the novel, it's played for laughs, because the Home Secretary is meant to be giving them a tour, but he can't, so it's a job of the PPS, and it becomes one of the many ways in which a PPS has to sort of clean up the mess of their minister. I think he gives them all tea on the terraces, doesn't he? And it's all very convivial. But it hadn't really struck me that probably, as you've just said, Anna, they might. These are a lot of them are probably only have had the vote for 2 or 3 years, so it's more than just something which you see now of MPs giving constituents tours.
Yes, they describes a massive and determined looking. A group of massive and determined looking ladies in a sea of printed voile. Which is a great image, but also it's like it is quite it's quite sexy, right? Yes, and then Robert really doesn't want to have to deal with them, so he manages to sort of take them to the tea rooms and just tells the waiters to give them whatever they want and then send the bill to the Home Secretary. He just can't wait to get rid of them. And there's a similar moment where there's a delegation of educationalists from West Africa, and West just says, "I don't know what to say to them. It's really awkward." And there's something about the way that he recoils from these figures who actually represent change, right? They represent change within Britain, change within the empire. They represent the sort of a future of politics, right? And he just goes through the novel dodging and trying not to have to deal with them, which is but it's very funny. Again,
One other element which I thought felt very contemporary, and actually sadly, tragically so, was this question of how much detail should the police release to the public in the immediate aftermath of a murder. And we've seen in the last couple of years there's been a whole series of controversies about whether the police have released too much or too little information. That little sort of side plot in the book felt that could have been written yesterday or today, couldn't it?
I can't believe this was written 100 years ago, but in a way, this is Britain. You kind of can.
Maybe it was Rachel Reeves in a time machine. You never know.
It's almost as plausible as the murder plot, if we're honest. But no, the point you made about West and the Empire, and this is the wonderful quote: "I never know what to say to people about the Empire, except it's a good old empire, isn't it? And so often they don't think it is." And it's just this vision of this terrible politician small talk. West seems like someone who, in most situations, would prime himself on this small talk. If he was having dinner at a Conservative association, you're pretty sure he would be able to charm the boots off whoever he was sat next to. That's very much feels like that's his thing. And he just, no idea what to say at all. And equally, what it says about Britain and it's what it thinks about empire in the 30s, I think is really interesting. Let's move on to the Phil Willis Award. Who's the most evil or Machiavellian character in this book? Well, obviously, spoilers preclude us from just saying the murderer. Eleanor, I think your nomination for Georges Roissel, the financier, is very, very solid. And given we've already said he dies, pretty spoiler-free.
I feel like several of the characters, if there were sequel books, would probably get up to a lot of no good in other aspects of their life. So I think there are several would-be future Phil Willis Award winners in the novel. Let's
instead then move to Barack Obama's tan suit. Best and worst bits of political detail. So you mentioned that West's friends just come from Iraq. Eleanor, I like the fact that the chairman of the Regal Iraq Company is David Davis. Thankfully doesn't have a big role in the book, because that would have been very confusing. I really like there's a reference to how MPs are listening to debates because they've got nothing better to do, and the only MPs that listen to debates, they've got nothing better to do, which made me think of those memes you have of sort of MPs discussing issue X and there's no one there, and MPs discussing their wages, and the chamber's full. And there's a really nice bit in which it talks about MPs just reading out their speeches, knowing they're being heckled, not caring they're being heckled because they just want it in Hansard so that they can report to their constituents that they've said it and it's in the newspapers. And again, it's just that now you'd make that a perfectly curated bit for social media.
I just love the political detail from the opening line of the book. And it's like the equivalent of, we've talked previously on this podcast about several political dramas that have scenes in the House of Commons. And some of them, like The Iron Lady, just get the way that MPs sit completely wrong and it immediately looks wrong. And some get the mishmash of different seating postures and so on right, and it immediately looks right. And I felt that with the very first line of this book. I mean, yeah, this is real. This is it. I'll just quote it. It's no matter how exciting the day, the House of Commons loses all interest between the hours of 7 and 9 p.m. The big speeches of the day have been made. The battle of the bigwigs is resumed after 9 o'clock. MPs must eat. And I don't know how formal the dinner hour still is in the procedure in the Commons, but in the Lords, it is called the dinner hour and other less important business is scheduled. So if you've got a big bill being debated, it will break for the dinner hour. Everyone goes and has dinner while less important stuff is debated in the chamber. And then everyone comes back from dinner and continues the... Obviously, when I say less important, it's obviously very important in its own right. One has to emphasize. But yeah, it just, right from the beginning, I thought, I'm in the hands of somebody who actually knows about politics, and obviously, clearly she does, given she was an MP.
If there is a didactic aspect to the book, though, then it perhaps is that she just wants to give us a sort of behind-the-scenes tour. A lot of that detail is kind of extraneous to the plot. It could be a little bit more pared back, but she clearly wants her readers to sort of feel as though they're in on a secret, right, or they're in on the little rituals and protocols and that kind of thing. And I suppose there's a question about why she might have wanted to do that and why that mattered to her, perhaps even at the expense of more sort of literary concerns with, a more elegant plot. And I suppose it is, a desire to sort of educate people about this institution that was, massive, had a massive influence over their lives, maybe.
And I don't know what her pitch to the publisher would have been, or just, how those pitches would have worked back then. But I think if you were a novelist now trying to pitch this to a publisher, you would definitely make something of, the standout bit about this book is the realism of the politics in it. That would be the reason that you'd hope the publisher would pick it up and give you a contract. But yeah, I mean, what you say comes through as well really nicely in one of the early descriptions of Robert West, which again I love for its political realism, but also sets him up as a character in a way that isn't quite followed through on. So she describes him, that was why, at 29, in his second year in Parliament, he was parliamentary private secretary to the Home Secretary, was known to everyone as Bob, and was well inside the comfortable fairway which leads in due but long course, when the tides of youth have ebbed, to that placid company of politicians who decorate the front bench of any particular government, whose names are seldom remembered during its lifetime and forgotten the day after dissolution. I mean, that is just such a lovely, eloquent description of those politicians who both make it to the top and yet are also instantly forgettable. And yet that sense of actually potentially unfulfilled potential isn't really developed in the character through the book, is it? It's like she's giving you the taste of politics, but then not, done other stuff with the character.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's a great sentence, isn't it, as well? It's just a great...
It's also one of those sentences that I really hate because it's a great sentence and yet it breaks a whole load of rules about good writing. And I just look at it and think, I've got no idea. How do you manage to write a sentence that good? It shouldn't work, and yet somehow it does. She definitely has a talent for writing above and beyond mine.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so she doesn't really see a kind of stellar political future for him, even though he seems to be on quite a good path. So he seems to be on very good terms.
Yeah.
He seems to be very good at moving around between different groups, which is why he's good for about 2/3 of the book as an amateur sleuth. Except that's also why he needs Grace to do the last bit of mystery solving, because she can talk to the servants and he can't. So she gets the final few pieces from them. But yeah, he seems to be this up and coming young Tory. But as you say, she imagines that he's going to sort of fade away quite quickly, that he's going to have a short-lived ministerial career and then be entirely forgotten about. And that's a bit strange. And you're right that it's not really followed up. And maybe she just thought that, that was the future of the Conservative Party.
Yeah. Well, also, I guess if I didn't know the politics of the MP who wrote the book, I think I might have guessed that they were a Conservative rather than Labour, because also, like, there's this lovely description of voting in Parliament, which both I think is sort of spot on, but again feels like it's the sort of comfortable pro-establishment viewpoint rather than the Labour Party wanting to change the system. The division bell rang for the last vote of the day. West ran up the stairs to vote. He hadn't the least idea what about, but that is the comfort of the House of Commons. It gives everybody such a comfortable feeling that something has been done about it. But what and how and why, even the men who were doing the something had very little idea beyond the immediate details of the day. That's a very sort of cosy, complacent, favourable view of politics, yet portrayed by quite a left-wing author.
Yeah, it's a book that's very affectionate about Parliament, actually. For somebody who was at least associated with the Communist Party, that there were periods in which the Communist Party was affiliated with the Labour Party, so you could certain periods be in both. Yeah, for somebody who is solidly on the left for her whole political career, yeah, this kind of affection. The one character who seems to be very much out to destroy old England and Parliament, who's a figure called Michael Holdsworth, who is a Socialist MP from Lancashire, who is described as semi-communist and someone who is not even loyal to his own party because his affiliations lie with Russia. He's pretty much an unpleasant character, right? We're not supposed to like him, and we're supposed to feel a bit sympathetic towards Parliament in the face of these kinds of people, which is quite strange, and is suggests that there's a kind of a certain kind of conservatism, or at least an attachment to sort of parliamentary democracy there that perhaps is stronger than we might expect to find, given what we know about Wilkinson.
A point that Aidan made in our Mr. Smith Goes to Washington episode, so we did a bit of a digression into the sort of first novels written about Parliament in the 30s, and the way that a lot of them, the aim is almost to essentially educate the new electorate about Parliament. Do you think that that's sort of happening here in some way? Is that part of why Ellen Wilkinson's written that? Or do you think it's more trying to write a golden age sort of mass market paperback, and so you slip in as much politics as you think you can get away with?
I think it is educative in the sense that it's trying to teach people about Parliament. As I say, that there's an affection for Parliament there, although it's not idealistic, and it does at numerous times point to the fact that the actual power of elected governments is constrained in various ways, sometimes by their own institutions like the civil service, but also often by sort of forces beyond their control. So it's not sort of idealistic, but I think it is participating in that larger project of educating new voters, I think.
And almost related to that, another bit of detail I like is the detail about the dress that the MPs have in the Commons. And again, we talked about the different dress of the senators in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington last time. The MPs from mining backgrounds all have tweed suits. Seeing those tweed suits in amongst all of the other sort of costumes that the high Tory male MPs are wearing, that's another one of those where, as you said, Eleanor, West obviously sees something is changing and he can feel it changing and isn't quite able to put a finger on what it is or whether he likes it or not.
I mean, and at the time that she wrote this, and indeed for quite a few decades afterwards, you had to, if you're an MP who wished to make a point of order, you had to put a top hat on, didn't you? There was a top hat that would be passed around the chamber. So that the contrast of that and the tweed suits is definitely very much feels like old world and new world coming.
Would I be right that there was no photography in the Commons at this time? I'm not quite sure. The average person probably didn't really have an understanding of any visual imagination of what the inside of the House of Commons looked like or what people wore. Television is a few years away. So one of the things it's doing with that visual detail is kind of filling in the gaps for people who otherwise couldn't visualize necessarily what things look like, I think.
With the bomb damage in the Second World War, there are some quite famous photos of the outside, well, actually, and the inside of the House of Commons chamber, aren't there, of the bomb damage? But I don't think there would have been any footage like on the Pathé newsreels from within Commons, and there wouldn't have been any photos. And indeed, the sort of the ban on that was more widespread than it became later, where you began to have some places where, say, journalists could. So yeah, I think it will have been pretty much only through paintings and the like that people will have had a sense of what the inside of the chamber was like. And certainly all the paintings I've seen make it seem much larger than it really is. They don't give that crowded sense.
They wouldn't have had them in the newspapers, would they? It wouldn't be like a courtroom. There isn't like a courtroom sketch, is there, in the Times of there's a parliamentary sketch, but that's the parliamentary sketch is a very different thing.
There is quite a famous old photo of MPs in the Commons that I have seen in the past. I was just checking. That's 1950, and I think that may have been a breakthrough moment.
What we've been talking about leads us on, I think, nicely to a very British coup. Just what you were saying, Ellen, about the distaste for Holdsworth. I think it's fair to say we'll probably have lost the whip fairly quickly in Keir Starmer's Labour Party.
We should say, as ever, for the record, that we are recording this after the end of Keir Starmer's first premiership and before the commencement of his second premiership, for anyone listening in the future.
Anyone in Rachel Reeves' time machine has come back. But there's a nice line of, again, I think it does involve Holdsworth, and the idea is that there's a chance that the opposition MP might ask the Home Secretary a particularly embarrassing question. West, as the PPS, is delegated to sort of say, don't do that, can you hold your horses a little bit? And the way he explains it is essentially all parties in the British House of Commons are more or less obliged to keep the show running somehow, which I think very much speaks to the point that you were saying, Eleanor. There's a bit of a coziness and there's a bit of an affection there, I think, from Ellen Wilkinson towards Parliament. But it's also, in a way, in a different light, that would be quite a populist message. We've done there's very different films, but say Election and King's Game sort of similarly have that political class, they're all the same. In those films, it's done quite negatively. It's not really, it's more a Yes Minister vibe in this one, I think. It's more a cosy vibe.
The more we discuss this, the more I would be less surprised if this book had been written by, say, Asquith in his, after having lost political power, than by a left-wing Labour MP. It's quite, the values that come through are intriguingly unexpected in many respects.
The other main conspiracy, I suppose, is the murder plot, which we can't really talk about for spoilers, other than to say it's quite ridiculous. Do
you think it is?
Well, it's not the most.
I'm not sure how we're going to have this debate without any spoilers. This is going to be very challenging for us.
But listeners will just have to read the book and comment on the Substack link to this post and see. It's not the most ridiculous resolution I've read in a British Library crime classics. The most ridiculous one was that the murder weapon was a massive block of ice that fell onto the head of the victim, and then the ice melted away. Cue impossible murder.
That seems to me an excellent way of murdering somebody and making the murder weapon disappear.
There's a certain ingenuity and engineering strength that maybe has to happen in the commitment of that murder, which you're relying on a lot of imponderables all coming together at once.
I think you're making dropping a heavy object sound a much more difficult escapade than it really is.
Possibly. We might be getting off. Yeah.
You desperate to change subject to move us on? Chair, next business.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to how to win an election then. Best and worst bits of political advice. Well, Ellen, you've got the best bit of political advice.
Yeah, don't make dodgy deals with obviously dodgy financiers, even if you did go on holiday together.
Who could that be a reference to?
Is this our obligatory Peter Mandelson reference? I mean, the fact that actually it's hard to narrow it down means it's a very simple bit of political advice which hasn't been followed very much.
So we learned that the Home Secretary has been on holiday. They go on a logging holiday, which sounds very interwar, a very strange thing, with Wazelle, the financier, and they become entangled in a way that is dodgy and problematic.
Logging holiday is quite Gladstonian, isn't it? Wasn't he always chopping down trees?
Yeah, that was all I could think of was Gladstone chopping down trees on his estate to deal with the stress of office.
I think my favourite bit of advice from the book is much more tactical than that, which is, it's again West speaking, where he says the best way to keep a political secret is to take a large hall and call a meeting and to make a speech about it. Then no one takes any notice.
I mean, that's also quite Trumpian, isn't it? This could go on a massive diversion, but it's a difference between Watergate and Trump.
We have already diverted into how hard or easy it is to drop a block of ice. Yeah, I think you're entitled to your diversion, Cory.
But yeah, it's the idea that Trump can basically blatantly admit that he's committing impeachable offences, but because it's not in some secret document, or it's not, someone whose face is badly blurred out giving information to someone in an underground car park, it doesn't have the same line. It's very much hiding in plain sight. I mean, there's some really excellent bon mots, which I'm going to try not to read out. We might just stick them in the newsletter to encourage you all to read the book. There's also a quote: a politician is taken more seriously if he has a substantial middle. Maybe that's one of the things that's maybe dated the most, because I suppose this is the sort of time when, if you were larger, it was seen as a sort of sense of prosperity and kind of good, stolid, sort of Middle England values. In a way, I don't feel that is quite the same now.
Although if you take middle as metaphorical, I think that probably does still work. That idea that you should have a hinterland, that there should be something more to you. In fact, there was a lovely example of this in a debate in the Lords the other day, where somebody made a very illogical, poorly evidenced point, but applied a quote from Winston Churchill to it, and immediately that gave it a sense of gravitas. It did make me go and read the Winston Churchill speech and think this speech doesn't actually back up the point that you're claiming the quote does. But for all that I'm knocking what somebody else said, I'm by no means averse to finding a quote, to drop into. That's the equivalent now of looking portly.
That's God tier Churchill evocation, isn't it? Is you just find a quote from Winston Churchill that it actually proves the exact opposite.
Yeah. Yes.
But then claim it. Actually, the other thing that I think is quite interesting, which again feels really, really relevant, is beware of the weekend. So essentially, the idea of governments in crisis, that MPs go back to their constituencies and hear all of the bad things about the government that are going on. That dynamic is definitely playing out. Definitely not with the Labour Party nowadays. Heaven fend, but in other governments in crisis, which are experiencing periods of popularity where local election campaigns happen, and then MPs go back, knock on doors, and hear lots of disgruntled residents about, say, the local council or about the Prime Minister or whatever it is. And I think that sort of thing does feed through. So that felt like a really kind of current bit of advice that still feels very, very, very relevant. To one of the things you were saying earlier in it, it's about the only time you hear about constituency work apart from that ship launching. Shall we go on to the Zeitgeist tape? And usually, Ellen, a podcast tradition would say that we now have to have Mark talk about a door, and we have a locked room murder mystery. So I approached this section with a certain amount of trepidation.
So I went on a little research trip in the Houses of Parliament a couple of hours before we recorded this podcast, because a lot of the events happen along in one room with the locked door, and there's this corridor that the room is off. And all of that is accurate. So the corridor exists. You can wander down the corridor. The rooms off it are the rooms off it. Several of them are rooms where people would have dinner, etc. It's all very, very similar. I think one or two of the rooms have changed purpose a little bit, but it's a very realistic setting. But also crucially, and again, I'm going to have to describe this very carefully to not give any spoilers, there is an architectural feature of the estate that is described in the book that is central to a plot point, which is absolutely right. If it weren't illegal to take photos on the estate, I would have been sending Cory several photos of examples of that architectural feature that I have spotted over the previous week. I'm not sure if that feature still exists in the location that is relevant for the plot of the book, because I think that may have been refurbished. But when I was there and looking along the corridor, peering through the door, trying not to look too suspicious, because what would I say if a policeman asked me, "What are you doing?" I'm trying to find out where a fictional murder took place, would not have been a helpful answer to give. But it's absolutely spot on, and much more so than other things that are set, nominally in Parliament. It really felt she has nailed the details right down to this architectural feature that is key to a certain plot point.
So now the TV series I think we should pitch is essentially New Tricks meets Ludwig meets House of Cards, which is you wandering around the parliamentary estate solving century-old murders.
They're the easiest ones to solve because you can almost flip to the end of the book. And also the door, if I can just add, appropriately, the door is the right sort of thickness and solidity that you can imagine. The door to the room is sufficiently substantial that it would have a real sense of what the heck happened mystery about it.
Yeah, because the murder takes place, it's in the Harcourt room, isn't it? Which I think Rachel Reeves in her introduction says is basically the Churchill room.
Yeah.
she talks in her introduction about also investigating around the House of Commons to see how it happens.
The problem is that the basic trick that is used for the locked room murder mystery is just a bit, ugh. And I say that even as someone who's willing to, defend the dropped block of ice on somebody. It did make me think that there is this fantastic novel called The Hollow Man, in which, in a just absolute bravuro display of arrogant authorship, the detective breaks the fourth wall at one point and explains to the reader all of these. There are so many different ways you can do a locked room murder, and basically throws away in a little rant about 20 absolutely brilliant plot devices that, other authors would have, been able to make a full career out. Just throws away all of it. And I think the one in this doesn't even meet the standard for that sort of, John Dixon Carr novel, sort of just throwaway one to show off to the reader. But in the end, I'm not sure that really matters, because you sort of know that there's going to be a trick, but working out the trick isn't really that central to the flow of the book.
Yeah, and The Hollow Man, I think, is the book that's the inspiration for the latest Knives Out film. I think Wake Up Dead Man, I think, isn't it?
Is it? Oh, well, maybe so. we can find some political angle to that to justify.
No, there's definitely a political angle. Right, I'm adding that to the list. Perfect. Here we
Absolutely.
go.
Bingo.
I was in two minds about whether the is kind of a red herring. It's kind of half a red herring. It's much less central than you expect it to be.
Yes.
Ooh, spoiler.
Well,
you cut that bit out.
Final item then. State of play. Yeah, Eleanor, what did you think coming back to this after a few years? How did it strike you compared to some of the other fictions you've sort of been reading as part of your other academic work?
I think I enjoyed it more as a political text than as a crime novel. I think I went to it originally reading it as a crime novel, and it is not very elegantly constructed. The pacing, as I mentioned, I think earlier on, is there's a long bit in the middle when nothing happens. When you've got 75 pages with loads and loads of plot threads being pulled together, to the extent that even reading it for the second time, I was still slightly confused about what was going on. So in that sense, I don't think it's fully successful as a crime, as a crime novel, as detective fiction. Reading it again, I think what struck me was that I haven't quite noticed how attuned it is to that moment of transition that we were talking about earlier, that sense of an old kind of England that's passing away, a new version of political modernity that's coming into being, and it registering it in this interesting and actually more complex way than I think I noticed when I read it the first time. So yeah, if I have to rate it out of 650.
Are you suggesting with that tone of voice that a score of 0 to 650 is not the logical scoring scale for a book, Eleanor?
Well, I've already seen both of your scores, so I'm trying to decide if I'm going to be more generous or not. I'm going to be slightly more generous. I'm going to say 450.
450. Oh, that's a good score. For me, I was really torn by it because I think, as I said up front, it is really two novels. As a political novel, like right from that first line, I absolutely love the feel of politics and how authentic it is. As a locked room murder mystery, it's if say a colleague in Parliament was to say, "Oh, I'm just getting into reading locked room murder mysteries. Any ones you'd recommend?" I'm not sure I would recommend this, even though they would, they might love the politics, because that locked room bit is just not quite, as you say, Eleanor, not really that great. And actually, at the end of this all, I am really puzzled about how small c conservative a lot of the viewpoints in the book are, given the left-wing politics of the author, which perhaps appropriately leaves a little mystery hanging in the air. So in the end, I've given it a 405. I'm really glad that you picked it. I'm really glad that I've read it, because I probably never would have otherwise. So huge thanks for that, Eleanor. If she had written a sequel, I would probably be reading the sequel at some point in the next sort of few years. Actually, I may come back to reread it at some point in the future, but probably not to read the whole book. I'll probably read a few of the bits to get the political flavour out of it, rather than to try to reread it to sort of re-enjoy the murder plot. 405. What about you, Cory?
I liked it. I'd be well up for doing Clash, her other novel, I think, at some point, because I think, she's a far better writer than Agatha Christie, I would say. Plot-wise, not so good. I've read quite a few of these British Library crime classics now, and I think the nice thing about them is that they all of them give you a little bit of an insight into the social history of the time, as well as being a murder mystery. And this, it's a really, really interesting look in Britain in the 30s, and also makes me want to find out more about that period and question some of my assumptions about what I thought the 30s was like. So I like it as a political novel, and I do enjoy it as a murder mystery, and I'll probably will keep it and read it for a third time. I'm midway between the two of you, 425.
You liberal, you fence-sitting liberal.
Well, say that when I've. It sounds like your bemusement at the small c conservative nature of the Labour left means that you need to have a 7-hour lecture on Labour factions. But we'll save that. We'll say, given we've got a guest on, we'll save that.
Elinor Wilkinson was the Morris Glassman of her time. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I will not be quoted on that. That'd be very, very harsh on Elinor Wilkinson. But Ella, thank you ever so much for coming on.
Absolutely.
A pleasure.
I realised, given that essentially suggested this book for you years ago, if there's ever a book or a film that you want to choose on the difficult second appearance, then you'll be very, very welcome.
Yeah. Nobody has managed a successful difficult second appearance yet, but then nobody has attempted it. So, it may actually be the bar is quite low for success.
I'll have a think.
As we've trailed, we've got an episode coming out in 2 weeks' time. If you want to hear about that and get some more bonus content, you can subscribe to our newsletter.
Absolutely. If you go to politicalfictions.substack.com, you can find a post for each of our previous episodes, and please do comment on them. We've had some really fun and interesting comments from people, and absolutely please add in your views on this novel as well. But you can also there sign up to get future emails, so you'll get notified when we have new episodes come out, including the one with Shane Whaley that we have briefly talked about in this episode, and also occasional bonus content from Cory about football.
And next time, so 2 weeks' time, we're cheating because we are doing a book, but we're doing the TV adaptation of a book, and we're talking about the first episode of First Amongst Equals, which you can view on YouTube, and we'll put a link to that first episode in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Please don't drop any ice on anyone over the summer.